Imagine the council offers you a brand new home. Not just any home. Streets in the sky, they call it. A whole neighbourhood lifted clear of the traffic, where children can play out safely, high above the cars, and your neighbours are never more than a stroll along the deck. And it is beautiful. Great sweeping curves of pale concrete, built for you, the working poor of Manchester, and sold to you as nothing less than the equal of Georgian Bath, that most elegant of English cities. Except this time, the grandeur is yours. It is, by every account, the most ambitious thing the city has ever attempted. A new Bath, in concrete, for everyone. It did not, on the whole, work out. So how does a dream that grand, that expensive, and by all accounts that genuinely well meant, become a place people are begging to leave almost before the paint is dry? How does the pride of an entire city end up so overrun with damp and vermin, thriving in the warm ducts behind its walls, that no amount of poison could ever clear them? And how does a thing built with such ambition come to be pulled down by the very council that built it, before it has even come of age, and then swept away so completely that you could stand on the very spot today and never know it had been there? This is the story of the Hulme Crescents. So let me show you how something that began as one of the proudest promises this country ever made to its poor turned, in barely a generation, into one of its most infamous failures. Because the tragedy of the Hulme Crescents is not that someone built a slum. Anyone can build a slum. The tragedy is that they were trying to build the exact opposite, and they had every good reason to believe they would succeed. To see how far it fell, you first have to see how high it was aiming. Now, to be fair to Manchester, the city had a genuine problem, and it was not a small one. Hulme, before all this, was a sea of Victorian terraces and back-to-backs, thrown up in a hurry a century earlier to house the workers of the world's first industrial city. And by all accounts, it was grim. In 1914, some 63,000 people were packed into Hulme, and the overwhelming majority of their homes had no bath and no proper laundry. By the 1930s, the area had been marked for slum clearance, apparently the largest such clearance anywhere in the country. So when the council looked at Hulme, it did not see a community it wanted to destroy. It saw a slum it was desperate to cure. And the cure, in the 1960s, seemed obvious. This was the great age of building upwards and building fast. Concrete panels cast in a factory and bolted together on site, whole neighbourhoods raised in a matter of months. The fashion of the moment was the deck access block, the so-called street in the sky. And this exact idea had already been tried and celebrated at a place called Park Hill over in Sheffield. It was modern, it was quick, it was cheaper, and it was, everyone agreed, the future. There is one small detail worth pausing on, because it comes back to haunt the whole story. The council's own planners back in 1945 had actually warned against all of this. Forcing families to live in flats, they wrote, would be a profound sociological mistake, because what British families really wanted was a house and a garden. Within 20 years, that warning had been quietly filed away and forgotten. And then there was the heating. The Crescents were originally meant to run on gas. But in 1968, a tower block in East London called Ronan Point partially collapsed after a gas explosion, and almost overnight the country lost its nerve about gas in tall buildings. So the plans were changed. The Crescents would be heated by electricity instead, warm underfloor heating buried in the concrete. It sounded rather luxurious. Do hold on to that, because it turns out to matter enormously. So this was the vision. Manchester handed the job to two of the most respected architects in the country, Hugh Wilson and Lewis Womersley. And what they designed was, on paper, genuinely beautiful. Not tower blocks, crescents. 4 vast, sweeping, curved blocks of flats. And the shape was no accident. They were consciously modelled on the great Georgian crescents of Bath, that 18th century masterpiece of English town planning, all elegant curves and grand proportion. Womersley said as much himself, in words that would later sound almost unbearable. His ambition, he wrote, was to reach at Hulme a solution equivalent in quality to the one achieved for 18th century Bloomsbury and Bath. And he meant it. They even named the 4 Crescents after the great architects of England's stately homes and royal palaces, men like Robert Adam and John Nash. Think about that for a moment. The grandest names in English architecture borrowed for a council estate and handed to the poorest people in Manchester, not as a favour, but as a right. This was to be Bath for the working man. And it was enormous. The Crescents alone held over 900 homes, and they were only one piece of a wider Hulme scheme of more than 3,000 flats, built to house something like 13,000 people. The wider scheme was, at the time, one of the largest public housing projects anywhere in Europe. The first residents moved into their gleaming new Crescents in 1972, and for a little while, standing in the shadow of those enormous curves, you could almost believe that the future really had arrived, and that it had arrived for everyone. And then people actually moved in. Because here is the thing about the streets in the sky. They did not work. Those wide, raised walkways, the ones meant to bring neighbours together, were open to the Manchester wind and overlooked by almost nobody. And the balconies were built so solid and so high that you could stand on your own deck and not see a single soul. The one feature that was supposed to recreate the friendly terraced street did the exact opposite. It left people alone, in the cold, high up. And it really was cold. Remember that clever electric underfloor heating, the one brought in after Ronan Point? Well, it turned out to be feeble and expensive, and then in 1973, the oil crisis sent energy prices through the roof, and heating a concrete flat with electricity became something almost nobody in Hulme could afford. So the flats were cold and damp, and the condensation ran down the walls, because the building itself had been done on the cheap. Bolts and ties reported missing, the insulation poor, the ceilings leaking, the concrete already crumbling at the edges. A brand new building, falling apart while people were still unpacking. And to make matters worse, they were not in there alone. The whole estate was warmed by long heating ducts that ran from flat to flat. And those warm ducts turned out to be a paradise for cockroaches and mice, which spread through the entire place and proved impossible to get rid of. There was asbestos in the building, you see, and by all accounts that made treating the ducts almost impossible. So no amount of poison ever really cleared them. And so people lived, quite literally, inside walls that crawled. And then, in 1974, the worst of it. A 5-year-old child fell to their death from one of the high balconies. The design had left a gap along the edge, just wide enough for a small child to climb through. It is the kind of detail that, once you know it, you cannot unknow. That death did not cause everything that followed. The complaints had been mounting for years, but it gathered all of them into a single point that no one could answer. This was not a safe place to raise a child. 643 residents signed a petition asking to be moved, and the council accepted, formally, that no family should ever again be housed above the ground floor here, which meant in practice that the families left. The children, the elderly, the disabled, all gradually rehoused, and the Crescents were left to single adults, to students, and to whoever else had nowhere better to go. And in 1975, just 3 years after those gleaming Crescents had first opened their doors, a survey went round and asked the people still living there what they made of their model homes of the future. 96% of them wanted out. So the families went, and the Crescents began their long slide. Of the very people it was built for, the estate became almost impossible to let. It turned into the place the council sent tenants who had no other options. And then, increasingly, into a place the council barely managed at all. By 1978, a national television programme, Granada's World in Action, sent its cameras into Hulme and came back with a phrase that stuck. It called this British council estate a Bantustan, borrowing the word for the segregated townships of apartheid South Africa. Around 60% of the people still living there, it reported, were on benefits. The walkways that the police found almost impossible to patrol earned the place a new nickname, the Hulme Wild West. And it was widely claimed, though the exact figure is impossible to pin down, that you were far more likely to be robbed, or worse, in Hulme than almost anywhere else in the country. And yet, here the story takes a turn that absolutely nobody had planned. Because as the council gave up, and the rent all but stopped mattering, into these condemned, half-abandoned concrete crescents poured exactly the sort of people who thrive on cheap space and no rules. Students, artists, punks, squatters, clubbers, and half the musicians Manchester was about to become famous for. Illegal clubs were knocked straight through the walls between abandoned flats, and for a strange, brief, glorious moment, the great, failed utopia became a real one. A genuine, chaotic, creative community. Right up until the day the bulldozers arrived. And arrive they did. By the early 1990s, barely 20 years after they had first opened, the Crescents were condemned. The demolition ran through, roughly, 1993 to 1995, and one of the boldest housing dreams this country had ever attempted was reduced to rubble and carried away in trucks. And in its place, the council did something rather remarkable. It built, as nearly as it possibly could, the exact opposite of what it had just torn down. Not towers, not decks, not streets in the sky. Ordinary, low-rise brick houses, with front doors that opened straight onto ordinary streets, with roads running through the middle again instead of around the edge. The entire modernist dream quietly put into reverse. The Hulme City Challenge, launched in 1992 with some £37 million of government money, began the rebuilding, and in time, around 3,000 new homes went up in place of the old. And there are two things left standing today that tell you almost everything. The first is a housing cooperative called Homes for Change, run by the residents themselves, who chose to keep a single medium-rise block with a shared walkway. A street in the sky, but this time small and human, and theirs. A quiet, knowing little tribute to the one idea everybody else had decided was a catastrophe. And the second is a bridge. The Hulme Arch, a single soaring arch thrown right across the main road, opened in 1997, and now the very symbol of the new Hulme. A beautiful, hopeful thing, standing more or less exactly where the Crescents used to stand. So what are we to make of it, in the end? Because it would be easy to say that Hulme failed because concrete is ugly, or because architects are arrogant, or because council estates simply never work. But that is not quite it, is it? The people who built the Crescents were not fools, and they were not villains. They were trying, harder than almost anyone had ever tried, to hand the poorest people in the city something truly beautiful. And that is the real, uncomfortable lesson of Hulme. The failure was not the ambition. The failure was believing that you could take something as fragile as dignity and a home and a whole community and mass-produce it, in a factory, out of concrete, in a matter of months. They promised these families Bath. They gave them a Bantustan. And then they gave them a quiet brick street and a beautiful new bridge, and rather hoped that everyone would forget. So I will leave it with you. Was Hulme a noble idea, ruined by bad concrete and worse luck? Or was it doomed the very moment someone decided that 13,000 human lives could be planned and stacked and poured? If you walked those quiet brick streets today, past the great arch that stands there now, would you ever guess what once stood there? And is there another Hulme going up somewhere right now, that we are all still busy calling the future? Let me know what you think, down below, and I will see you in the next one.